I was 16 years old when everything in my world shifted, leaving me standing in the wreckage of what used to be a normal, quiet life. We lived in Amoni, a small village nestled between rolling hills and dense forests in eastern Nigeria. The village was known for its serenity. Except for the occasional squabbles over land disputes, we lived in harmony. My mother, Nneka, was one of the most respected women in the village. She was gentle, hardworking, and deeply religious, always the first to arrive at church on Sunday, leading the choir in her soft but powerful voice. Our pastor, Pastor Ebube, had recently moved to our village from the big city. He was young, charismatic, and had a way of stirring the emotions of the congregation. People said he could see visions, heal the sick, and deliver people from evil spirits. The church had never been so full, and every Sunday, villagers from far and wide would flock to hear him preach. His booming voice carried through the church like a thunderstorm, and his eyes seemed to pierce into your soul. But I never expected that one Sunday service would tear my family apart. It was an unusually hot Sunday afternoon, the kind of heat that seemed to cling to your skin and make the air thick with humidity. I remember it clearly because that was the day the world seemed to stop. We had just finished the praise and worship session when Pastor Ebube stepped onto the pulpit. His eyes roamed over the congregation as though searching for something or someone. After a long pause, he spoke. "The Spirit of the Lord has revealed something to me," he began, his voice low but firm. "There is a witch in our midst, someone who has been casting spells, destroying families, and causing sickness in this village. That person is sitting right here, pretending to be holy." A murmur swept through the church like a gust of wind. People looked around whispering, their eyes darting from face to face, wondering who the witch could be. "God has shown me who it is," Pastor Ebube continued. He took a deep breath, and then his eyes landed on my mother. "Sister Nneka." My heart stopped. Gasps echoed through the church as people turned to look at my mother. My head spun. This had to be a mistake. How could the pastor accuse my mother, my loving, prayerful mother, of being a witch? "I see in the spirit that you have been responsible for the misfortunes of many in this village," Pastor Ebube said, pointing directly at her. "You have cast spells, caused sickness, and brought ruin to your neighbors." My mother sat frozen, her eyes wide in disbelief. The congregation watched in stunned silence. I could feel their stares, their judgments already settling in. It felt like the walls of the church were closing in on us. The service ended in chaos. Some people hurried out, whispering to each other, while others stayed behind to console my mother. She didn't say a word as she gathered her things and quietly left the church, her face pale and her eyes empty. I followed her, my mind racing. How could this be happening? Pastor Ebube had to be wrong. But by the time we reached home, the damage had already begun. Rumors spread like wildfire through the village. Neighbors who had once greeted my mother with smiles now avoided her, their eyes filled with suspicion. Mothers pulled their children away when we walked past, as though my mother's supposed witchcraft could infect them. It wasn't long before the elders of the village came to our house. They sat in a circle outside, grim-faced, as they told my mother that they had to investigate the pastor's claim. Witchcraft was a serious accusation in our village. If she was found guilty, she would be banished, ostracized from the community. My mother, tears in her eyes, swore on everything she held dear that she was innocent. But the villagers didn't care. The pastor's words held more weight than her tears. They were determined to find the truth. The investigation began with visits to the homes of the sick and suffering in the village. People who had lost crops, fallen ill, or had mysterious problems suddenly found ways to connect their misfortunes to my mother. One woman claimed that her chickens had stopped laying eggs ever since my mother walked past her house one evening. Another said her child had fallen ill shortly after my mother visited her to offer soup when the baby was born. It was all ridiculous. Coincidences blown out of proportion by fear and superstition. But in a village like ours, where explanations for bad luck were often tied to the supernatural, these stories were enough to convince people. My mother's name was on everyone's lips, and soon she stopped leaving the house altogether. I couldn't sit idly by and watch her life be destroyed by lies. I went to Pastor Ebube, determined to confront him. I found him sitting in his office at the church, flipping through his Bible. I stood before him, trembling with anger. "Pastor, how can you accuse my mother of being a witch?" I asked, my voice shaking. "You know she's innocent. She's a good woman. Everyone knows that." Pastor Ebube looked up at me, his expression calm but stern. "The Spirit revealed it to me, my child," he said, his voice gentle. "This is not a matter for debate. God has spoken." "But you're wrong," I shouted, my frustration boiling over. "You're ruining her life." He stood up, placing his hand on my shoulder. "Sometimes the truth is hard to accept," he said softly, "but the will of God must be done." I left the church in tears, realizing that there was no reasoning with him. The pastor's word was law in this village. If he said my mother was a witch, people would believe him no matter what. As the days went by, things only got worse. My father, who worked in a neighboring village, returned home after hearing the rumors. He was furious and demanded answers from the village elders. But they refused to back down, insisting that the pastor's vision was enough to warrant a full investigation. My father was helpless. Despite his anger, he knew that going against the church and the village elders could lead to worse consequences. At night, I could hear my mother crying in her room. It broke my heart. She had always been a strong woman, a pillar in our family, but now she seemed so fragile. The accusations were eating away at her. And then, one night, something happened that made everything even more terrifying. One evening, just as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows over the village, a group of women from the church arrived at our home. They were led by Mama Ogechi, one of the most respected women in Amoni, known for her devotion to the church and her loud mouth in all village matters. The moment I saw them approaching, I knew trouble was brewing. The women marched in, their faces solemn and their heads wrapped in vibrant traditional jewel. They wore long wrappers tied tightly around their waists, and each one held a Bible like soldiers preparing for battle. "Nneka," Mama Ogechi said, her voice commanding as she stepped into our compound. "We have come to pray for your deliverance." My mother, still reeling from the accusations, stood at the door looking frail but defiant. "Deliverance from what?" she asked quietly, but there was a tremor in her voice. Mama Ogechi's eyes narrowed. "The pastor has declared you a witch, and the entire village has borne witness to the strange happenings around you. We will pray until the evil spirit leaves your body." The women formed a circle around my mother, chanting and shaking their Bibles. It wasn't long before their voices grew louder, more forceful. They swayed from side to side, and the intensity of the prayers escalated. Mama Ogechi's voice pierced through the air like a blade, calling down fire and brimstone from heaven. I watched, horrified, as they began to press closer to my mother, almost suffocating her with their presence. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. My father was away at the time, and there was no one to intervene. The village, once filled with laughter and peace, had turned into a battleground of faith, and my mother was their target. Enough, my mother finally shouted, breaking through the cacophony of voices. I am not a witch. I have served this village and this church for years, and this is how you repay me? By accusing me of something I have never done. The women stopped abruptly, their eyes wide. Mama Ogechi stared at my mother, her lips curling into a frown. Witchcraft doesn't announce itself, she spat. We are only trying to help you, Nneka. If you are innocent, why resist? Before my mother could respond, another voice called out from the edge of the compound. It was the village chief, Igwe Amadi. His regal presence, adorned in the finest agbada embroidered with gold patterns, silenced everyone. He carried a staff of office, a symbol of his authority, and behind him were some of the elders. The chief's voice was like thunder when he spoke. What is going on here? He demanded, looking at the women and then at my mother. The pastor has spoken, Igwe, Mama Ogechi said with an air of authority. We are only doing what is right to protect the village. Igwe Amadi, known for his wisdom, nodded slowly. I have heard the accusations, and I have come to witness for myself. But remember, this village was built on unity, not on fear. He turned to my mother. Nneka, do you deny these accusations? I do, Igwe, my mother said, standing tall. I have done no wrong. The chief looked her in the eyes for a long moment. There was an unsettling silence, the kind that made my skin crawl. Finally, he sighed. The village must be careful with such serious accusations, he said, glancing at the women. But in our tradition, we cannot dismiss the word of the church lightly. The village elders will need to convene to decide the next step. A week later, a trial was arranged at the village square under the great Iroko tree where generations of decisions had been made. The entire village gathered, dressed in their finest traditional clothing. The women in brightly colored wrappers and beaded necklaces, the men in agbada and isiegu sat cross-legged, murmuring among themselves as they awaited the proceedings. The air was heavy with tension and anticipation. At the center of the square stood my mother, flanked by my father and me. Opposite us, seated on wooden stools, were the village elders, including Igwe Amadi, and, of course, Pastor Ebube. He was dressed in a flowing white robe, holding his Bible close to his chest, his face calm, but his eyes cold. To prove or disprove the accusation of witchcraft, the village elders decided to rely on an ancient tradition, the test of the waters. It was a ritual used in the past, rarely practiced anymore, but still considered sacred in Amobi. The accused would be taken to the sacred stream, where they would undergo a purification rite. If the waters accepted them, they were declared innocent. If not, the accused would be banished forever. My stomach churned at the thought of my mother being subjected to such a test. The sacred stream was deep in the forest, a place most villagers avoided unless absolutely necessary. Stories of the stream had been passed down for generations. Some said spirits resided there, judging the hearts of those who dared to step into its waters. When the chief spoke, his voice was final. Nneka, you have been accused of witchcraft. To clear your name, you must face the test of the waters. Will you submit yourself to the will of the gods and the judgment of the spirits? My mother, ever dignified, nodded her head. I will. The next morning, just as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, we made our way into the forest. The entire village followed at a distance, whispering in hushed tones. My heart raced as we walked deeper into the woods, the thick canopy of trees above casting long, eerie shadows. I could hear the rustling of leaves, the distant calls of birds, and the steady drum beats in the distance, a rhythm that seemed to match my own heartbeat. We arrived at the sacred stream, its waters dark and still. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and ancient roots. The elders stood around the bank, chanting softly in the old language, their voices blending with the sounds of the forest. My mother, dressed in a simple white cloth, stood at the edge of the water. She looked so small, so vulnerable, but there was no fear in her eyes. She stepped into the stream, her feet sinking into the cool mud beneath. As the water rose around her legs, the chanting grew louder. The villagers held their breath. I clenched my fists, praying silently for the gods to show mercy. Suddenly, the water began to ripple. A low murmur spread through the crowd as the ripples grew stronger, swirling around my mother's ankles. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched in horror. The swirling water began to rise, climbing up her legs, then her waist, until it reached her chest. Gasps echoed through the crowd. What happened next would forever be etched into the history of our village. The water continued to rise, swirling angrily around my mother, as though the stream itself was alive, judging her with every ripple. I wanted to scream, to run to her, but my feet felt like they were rooted to the ground. The air was thick with tension, and I could hear the low hum of whispers from the villagers behind me. Some were praying, others murmuring their doubts, but all eyes were fixed on the scene unfolding before them. Suddenly, the water rose higher, past my mother's chest, her shoulders, and then it engulfed her entirely. She disappeared beneath the surface, swallowed by the stream. The villagers gasped in shock, and I felt my heart drop into my stomach. I couldn't breathe. Time seemed to slow down as we all waited, frozen, to see what would happen next. For what felt like an eternity, there was no movement. The water was eerily still, as if it had claimed her, and all hope seemed lost. Then, out of the water, a hand broke the surface, my mother's hand. She emerged slowly, gasping for air, her body drenched but alive. Relief surged through me like a wave. She had survived. The gods had not forsaken her. But before anyone could celebrate, something unimaginable happened. The water began to boil, steam rose from the surface, and a loud hissing sound filled the air. My mother looked around, confused and terrified, as the villagers took a step back. The elders, who had been chanting, stopped abruptly. Even Pastor Ebube, standing at the edge of the crowd, seemed taken aback. Without warning, the water surged up again, violently pulling my mother back under with such force that she didn't have time to cry out. The stream churned and twisted as though possessed by a malevolent spirit. I screamed, rushing forward, but my father grabbed me, holding me back. "No, let me go," I shouted, fighting against his grip. But it was too late. The water stilled once more, and my mother did not reappear. She was gone, completely swallowed by the stream. A stunned silence fell over the crowd. The only sound was the distant cry of birds and the rustling of leaves. My heart raced in my chest, my body trembling with shock. The elders, usually calm and composed, exchanged worried glances. Pastor Ebube stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with something dark and triumphant. "The waters have spoken," he declared, his voice loud and commanding. She was guilty. "No," I screamed, breaking free from my father's grip. I ran to the edge of the stream, falling to my knees. She wasn't guilty, she was innocent. The stream, the stream. I couldn't find the words. How could anyone explain what had just happened? Pastor Ebube turned to face the villagers, lifting his hands as though delivering a sermon. "Let this be a warning to all who harbor evil in their hearts. The spirits do not lie. The judgment of the stream is final. Nneka was a witch, and she has met her fate." I stared at him, my mind swirling with disbelief. How could he say such a thing? My mother was not a witch. She had been kind, loving, and faithful to the church for as long as I could remember. The villagers, however, began to murmur among themselves, nodding in agreement with the pastor. Fear had taken root in their hearts, and they were too afraid to question the results of the ancient ritual. My father, who had been silent all this time, stepped forward, his face pale and drawn. "We will not accept this," he said, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "My wife was no witch. This is not justice." The pastor turned to him, his eyes narrowing. "Would you challenge the will of the gods Nwafor? Or perhaps," his voice trailed off, his gaze piercing, "perhaps you too are tainted by her evil?" The accusation hung in the air like a dagger. The villagers shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to believe. My father stood tall, his jaw clenched, but the weight of the pastor's words seemed to press down on him. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, a voice rang out from the crowd. "You have gone too far, Ebube." It was Chief Igwe Amadi. He pushed through the crowd, his staff in hand, his face dark with anger. "We trusted you to lead us in faith, but this is not the work of God." The pastor's eyes flickered with a mixture of surprise and defiance. "Igwe, I am merely a vessel of the divine will. The stream has judged." Igwe Amadi's eyes blazed with fury. "You have twisted our traditions to suit your own agenda. This village has always been governed by truth and fairness, not fear, mongering, and superstition. I will not allow this travesty to stand." But the damage had already been done. The villagers were frightened, and in their fear, they clung to the pastor's words. Many began to nod, murmuring about the strange events they had witnessed, how my mother had been different recently. The whispers grew louder, feeding into the hysteria. In that moment, I realized that the truth didn't matter anymore. My mother was gone, and no one would fight for her innocence except for me and my father. Just as Igwe Amadi turned to leave, a voice spoke softly behind him. Wait. It was Pastor Ebube again. He raised his hands and the crowd fell silent. I had hoped we would not have to go this far, but there is more that needs to be revealed. He motioned to one of the women in the crowd, and to my shock, it was Mama Ogechi. She stepped forward, her eyes downcast, but there was something off about her expression. A flicker of guilt, or perhaps fear. Mama Ogechi has confessed to me that she witnessed Nneka practicing dark rituals, Pastor Ebube said, his voice calm but deadly. She was too afraid to speak before, but now the truth must come out. The crowd gasped. My knees buckled and I felt sick to my stomach. Mama Ogechi, the same woman who had come to our house to pray for my mother's deliverance. I could hardly believe it. Mama Ogechi nodded slowly, her voice shaking as she spoke. I didn't want to believe it, but I saw her, late at night, by the river, chanting, talking to spirits. The villagers erupted in murmurs, and I saw the fear in their eyes turn into certainty. My mother, the woman I had known all my life, had been condemned, not by the spirits, not by the gods, but by the very people she had trusted. The pastor's lips curled into a satisfied smile as he delivered his final blow. Nneka was not just a witch, she was a danger to us all. And just like that, the verdict was sealed. The crowd, once hesitant, now fully believed in my mother's guilt. The same people who had come to her for help, for prayers, for wisdom, were now calling her evil. My father grabbed my arm, pulling me away as the villagers began to chant, "Burn the witch." I looked back one last time at the sacred stream, where my mother's body had been claimed by forces I would never understand, and I felt something break inside me. The village of Amoni had turned into a nightmare, and we had lost more than just my mother that day. We had lost our humanity. As we fled, I vowed never to forget what they had done. The day my pastor accused my mother of witchcraft was the day I swore to bring the truth to light, no matter the cost. But for now, the darkness had won. Thank you. Stay tuned for more captivating Africa story.